Next on stage, we have Rachel Shepard, and she is from Atlassian, but she's going to talk about designing something that I don't even dare to pronounce, but it's about agents and orchestration. So you're much better at this than I am. Rachel, please take the stage. Everyone, big round of applause for Rachel Shepard.
Okay, do the thumbs up. You can hear me good? Awesome, yay. Okay, yeah, I'm a designer. I thank you for entrusting some advice about agent orchestration from someone with a fine arts degree. But I am like your token creative on a platform team. And, clicker. I graduated from design school, but I very quickly transitioned into pretty complex products. In the early days, I worked on things like System Center, shipped Windows Enterprise, first versions of Azure, and then last project, my big project at Microsoft was shipping Azure AI Foundry. So I've worked in these sort of like in-between technical spaces between UX and platform for quite a while. And thanks for jumping ahead and getting the question of who's used our product. Sounds like everybody. Atlassian is a huge suite of applications. Newest being Rovo. We'll talk about that in a second. But one of the reasons I've joined Atlassian is because they are really making a culture shift around leading product design and strategy with design. Right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that looks in practice. Like I said, I've been doing this a long time. A lot of folks say, hey, we're customer-led or we're design-driven, but in practice, it's actually quite rare. So I'm going to talk through like the tactics of how to do that kind of thing. The case study that I'll use to walk through that process is a design sprint that we did just about maybe 10 or 12 weeks ago. So this is very, very current. A multidisciplinary, cross-functional group that did a design sprint to think about how do we really want to show agents to end users. Quick framing, in case you're not familiar with the whole product suite. The reason I want to spin through these is because agents cross all the boundaries of products, right? And so some of the experiences that I'll talk about, I want to frame these up for you. At the center of all the products and these systems of work is Rovo. Rovo came out about a year ago. It is you could call it Copilot-esque, but it's more than that. It's an embedded, integrated AI teammate. It works across your search experience, chat. It's embedded in workflows. Some of the things that I think are interesting about it from my perspective is that it maintains memory across apps and sessions. It honors data segregation, and it's sort of different than other Copilot-like experiences because it comes out of the box integrated with third-party connectors. To do something like this, you have to have a great graph. So to support these new experiences for agents and Rovo and any of the kinds of applications or analytics that you want to do across your app footprint, you have to have a great graph. And then also you have to have extensibility, right? We know that anybody in the modern workplace has a whole suite of applications that you're using. You're not just going to be on Atlassian. You're going to be using a whole bunch of stuff. So we're very quickly shipping a lot of connectors that bring everything together on a single graph. Another new product that's come out in the last year is a Studio, which is a low-code, no-code, vibe coding experience for anybody who wants to build an agent or an automation or an app on top of Teamwork Graph. So anyways, the reason I bring all these up is that the agent experiences touch each of these points, so we'll dig into that next. All right, virtual teammate sprint. So this was the design sprint. I led it as a subject matter expert from design, but I want to say who all the other team members were, not specifically, but we pulled together designers from the four corners of the company. We also had an engineering lead, we had a product lead, and then the most important team member was, second to the end, our chief design officer. And we dedicated 2 whole weeks. He dedicated 2 to 3 hours a day. Huge time commitment, but really paid off. And if I was to give you any single point of advice for running a design sprint, it's to have an executive in the room, right? So you make a lot of decisions on the fly, and they can sort of agree to that or unblock it. And then when you get to that point of needing to manage up, share out your new strategy, they can do that for you. So get an executive in the room, or at least a sponsor, made a huge difference for us. And our sprint, so what was it that we were trying to do? We needed to talk about this concept of virtual teammates. Virtual teammates as a term, I think came out of some executive meeting where someone was like, hey, I have a great idea. Let's do virtual teammates. And then as soon as somebody says that, all of a sudden teams are putting it in their product roadmap. Designers are prototyping it. It kind of spirals out of control. without pausing. And luckily, our leadership had the foresight to say, before we start building and shipping all this stuff, maybe we should take like a little bit of time to look at it. Is this the strategy we want? Do we know what agents are? Do we all agree? And probably the most important question that you're trying to answer is, will the experiences that we're shipping drive adoption, right? Like that's ultimately what you're trying to figure out. So the sprint mission was, how do we design agent experiences? This is an example of a screen of one of the agent experiences that were already in production. So, there's a thesis here, which is that good design or good experiences can drive adoption. I want to show you why this is important. This slide is a little bit of a bummer, but in the last 6 to 8 weeks, there's more and more research I would say, it's not research, it's just more like insights and analysis on how AI adoption is happening in real enterprises and companies, and it is falling flat. There is an adoption problem. This is after things are working, right? This is after there's a relative good foundation of quality. There's something standing in the way. So I want to talk about the user research that addresses why we think this is happening. The good news, the flip side of that, is that for that 5%, or the people who make it over the hump, they're quite happy. They're finding significant impact on their operations and on their daily workflow. So the question is how do we get them there, right? And what I would challenge everyone here is that you need to start, especially if you're in product development, rapidly reorient towards adoption and start thinking about this as a top-down problem and sort of get out of the weeds of technology. I would say 9 out of the 10 teams I meet to talk about their AI experiences come to me with what they think of as hey, here's how our experiences are great. Check out our groundedness metrics. Our latency is amazing. And I'm like, that's great, but that's table stakes, right? Quality of response is just fundamentals. Users expect things to work. So what happens after that? It's pretty well known that adoption is really correlated with user trust, but I want to talk about an idea that we discovered in our user research during the sprint. And it's this concept around the relationship between user expectation and expectation management and user trust. So here's the formula for building trust with AI. We did a large deep dive into emerging research. There's a lot of research that's come out recently. I will not try to summarize all 200 pages here, but I will give you a few slides that capture the gist of it. So we addressed this relationship between trust and adoption. We all sort of understand that. But here's this new idea, which is that the mental model informs trust. And when you match the user's mental model, trust goes up or trust goes down. And then, of course, adoption goes up or down. So there's a lot of things that can go into adoption. There's discoverability, applicability, that kind of stuff. But this trust factor is huge. The takeaway really is that the delta between someone's expectation and the way things work is what determines their level of trust. Pretty much immediately, it's easy for us to understand, okay, yeah, you use something, it under-delivers, it's not working well, user trust is broken. But the exact same concept applies on the flip side. And this is easy to do in AI. When somebody uses something and it's more powerful than they expected, it has more capabilities than they understand, they also don't trust it. They're less likely to reuse it because it's not matching their mental model of how the thing is supposed to work. So understanding people's mental models is really key. And I have to say, with AI, we're starting at a deficit there. If you ask 100 people, if I asked you all what an agent is, I'm going to get 100 different answers, right? And this is a room of experts. So imagine if you're talking to your average knowledge worker, they actually don't have a mental model. And maybe it's informed by media or their sister or their last boss or whoever. They've kind of got an idea how they think it's supposed to work. And this is a jump scare slide, so I'm going to go easy on you. But I cannot overemphasize, when we did interviews with your average knowledge worker, they are not excited about agents. Does anyone know what this movie is? Arrival? Yes, so Arrival is a great movie. We can talk about that later. I think it's actually a movie about natural language, and it gets into tokens. It gets into how do people communicate to each other. And I think it summarizes people's relationship to AI pretty well, which is, in this one, she's a linguist, and she's trying to understand who they are, what they do, and she doesn't know, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying for you as an audience, right? I don't know what this thing does. People feel the same way about AI, right? They just don't know what it is, and especially agents. So when we applied these same concepts from agents around, adoption of AI to agents, here's some of the things we walked away with. One is that actually labeling something an agent can be an impediment to adoption. What you're doing is you're labeling it as something that people don't understand. A lot of the things that we heard from customers were like, well, wait, is an agent an actual person, or is it just a bot? Does it do an automation for me? They're also very concerned about this idea that if they're talking to an agent, is their peer and their boss also talking to the same agent, which I thought was really interesting. There's just sort of like questions about how these things work, and people are a little bit, well, a lot hesitant. So the expectations are unclear with agents. This led the group to, I think we're like 4 or 5 days into the design sprint now, by the way, in terms of a 2-week timeline. Some principles. And so the first principle is around meeting users where they are, matching their expectation in whatever we produce, figuring out how to reduce cognitive load for them, removing as many concepts as possible, and focusing on the outcomes, rather than how we've built the thing, trying to get them to where they want to go. So where we started, this is like some before screens, and the summary is that we're dealing with agent sprawl, and we have this problem of personification of an agent. So, like I showed you this slide before, but we pretty much left behind role-based agents in the first few days. We knew we didn't want to call it a person name. We knew we didn't want it to use its own pronouns. We knew that we did not want to position this as a person. That was quick. This was just a tiny sampler of the number of agents that all of the product teams at Atlassian were building. As you can imagine, it's a really big company. You take every single app, they're brainstorming 2 or 3 agents that can work in their app. And this is like sort of on the roadmap already while we were running the design sprint. It was, dozens and dozens of these things were emerging all across our product landscape. And the question was like, okay, so what do we do with those if we know agents aren't good in terms of being role-based and we know there's too many? So ultimately, we discovered, we have got this agent sprawl problem, especially usability. End users cannot remember which agents to use, when, where, how. I even had teams who were trying to propose naming agents like Eleanor and stuff like that. Can you imagine having a whole fleet of things to deal with? It's not going to work out. On the platform side, I think it's pretty easy to understand. A small task-based agent, they're relatively straightforward. You've got some sort of prompt, you've connected it with some tools and some skills, and it's able to generate a response, and that's fine. This is where people were starting. But very quickly, the teams were creating heavier, I think of them as heavy agents, more and more complex agents with more and more capabilities. And again, map this back to those dozens that I showed you. But then you add the fact that we have a single agent, sort of like a hero agent, that lives on top of all of this and is trying to coordinate these things. So the UX and everything, we basically ended up with a really inconsistent, hard, heavy experience, and our platform was hitting its limitations for scale. So how did we address this? Just revisiting the design principles before we jump into the designs themselves. But yeah, trying to figure out user expectations, reduce cognitive load, focus on outcomes. So here's where we got to. This is a before screen. Most people, I don't know, have used Confluence Whiteboard. It's kind of like a sticky note application. Teams use it to collaborate. This was a design that was an internal beta, so it never shipped. I don't expect you to know it. But the team had brainstormed this concept of a whiteboard agent, right? So you ask the agent to do stuff for you. But when we took a look at it, it was like, well, these are a couple tasks, but there's no autonomy, there's no non-deterministic outcome, there's no reason to monitor or have insight or transparency into what it's doing. These are just features. So what would happen if we reposition those features directly into the UX, right? Why don't do we even need to call them AI? It's just stuff that works. So that was where we started to head. We have really good data internally around this direction. So think of this as transparent AI. We know that, so this is a Confluence feature. I think it's in Jira as well. When you highlight text, it gives you the option to define it, and it'll give you a definition, even organizational acronyms and stuff like that. This is one of our most popular AI features, and people don't even know it's AI, right? And actually, the question is sort of by not calling it AI, are people using it more? So this is one of the things that we had data in our pockets about. And so that sort of leads us in this direction of what can we pull apart. It also started asking a new question. This is Rovo Chat. On the left is where we've taken some of that same capabilities that you saw inside of Whiteboard and put them into Rovo. What would happen if you could do the same thing from anywhere? Or then on the right, what would happen if you could invoke that thing from anywhere, right? Is there a way that we can start helping people on board to all the capabilities that are here, since they usually just don't know? And ultimately, this led us into a direction of dissolving agents. We started just pulling them apart, not calling them an agent, and instead making them into more composable, smaller units. We ended up calling these skills. I would say a large portion of the design sprint was on norming on terminology and taxonomy. That's kind of a painful part of the process, but it is super necessary. But we came up with skills. It's a nice, more generic term, sort of known in the industry, but not necessarily technically defined. It's an umbrella term. And this direction, what it led us to is, this was before. Before we had all these first-party agents showing up in Jira Confluence, then we had these low-code, no-code agents that you could make in Studio or deploy yourself. And then we have more like richer agent experiences through Forge, so that'd be like Canva or GitHub Copilot, things like that. Just a lot of agents on the scene. And by dissolving those, we got it down to basically 2 buckets. So on the left, you've got Rovo, and Rovo can use a bunch of capabilities or skills. People can still bring their own custom or 3P agents, but at least we've reduced the cognitive load significantly, right? Like we went from 30, 40 of these things to now just Rovo, and then whatever you bring on your own. The next part of the process was, it kind of forked. At this point, we had our engineering lead start running proofs of concept to figure out, would this direction be feasible based on the capabilities we have on the platform now? And design started looking at sort of the visual language and where do we want this to show up and how do we keep it on brand? This is some of the explorations there for these componentized skills. And then we also had to do some work in collaboration with engineering on what kind of skills do we want? We knew that we could ship Atlassian skills out of the box, but we also knew we wanted to have 3P for us, skills like for Slack or Asana, bringing those in. And we also want to give people the ability in Studio to write their own types of skills. So, these are all relatively, it's sort of democratizing the ability for anybody to create skills, and then it can be invoked from anywhere. What I like about it is that one of the things that we have a challenge with in onboarding people to AI is that they may not know the capabilities. Like they just don't know how much it can do. So now when you do a slash inside of Rovo, you get an option of all the skills and capabilities, and you can immediately do those. But of course, like on the right, you can just use natural language. You don't have to invoke a skill. Under the covers, the skill is being invoked, right? But there's no reason to necessarily have to tell the user that. Do it 2 ways, it's fine. This is Studio. So the question here is how do we help people build out their own custom agents and add skills to those agents? But it includes and expanded into MPC server skills. You can add any of these 3P skills to your custom agent. And what's great about this is how it shows up in the UX. So this is a different way it shows up. This is showing latency and showing transparency into processes that are happening. These are the same skills, right, that are being invoked. So it gives users a kind of a more, rather than, before it may have been call HubSpot agent, and then it was call PM agent. It's very opaque. But here it's sort of specific tasks, and you can show customers where things are failing, or you can troubleshoot, that kind of thing. So it's a nice extra bonus. But in summary, we dissolved agents into skills. We removed a lot of them from our UX. This just seems like a more approachable concept. The numbers right now are good. Where we have swapped stuff out, we're seeing usage climb and climb and climb into that transparent AI pattern. But as promised in the title of this, we're going to talk a little bit about how this affected our platform. So we did this 2-week sprint. Engineering was involved. They did their proof of concept in parallel. And they did have to sort of change direction in an important way. Something that we spent a lot of time on from design, talking to the engineering team, was the idea that you do not need to have one-to-one parity in the UX of what you have in architecture. Basically, I've worked on a lot of products where there was this premise that whatever's in the command line, you have to show in the UI. You always have to have that parity. And here, talking the engineering team into sort of letting that go, that it's perfectly fine to abstract and then make a creative or design decision on what you want to show. Now, heading into the skills abstraction concept is super helpful though, because it serves a dual purpose. We are able to basically invoke into the UX the same way you can invoke in the orchestration layer. Engineering are liking this. I'll give you kind of a quick summary. So, before our teams were just using the kind of the predictable primitives for all of their agent orchestration, tools and actions and embeddings. And skills are really just an abstraction layer. They're not made of anything like legendary or new. It's just a collection and different way to describe and collect capabilities. But then grouping skills, we used the different kinds of metadata and then also putting them on MCP-based grouping to organize the skills. It was really great because it can serve on the orchestration layer and on the UX layer in the same way, right? So that's just cleaner. The other thing that this sort of pushed us to think about was a registry. And now I'm not here to tell you that like a registry and composability is some sort of new concept. It's actually just like good architecture 101. The point is that the teams were not doing this before. The platform team was not thinking this way, right? Everyone was out building their own agents, but with the change in the experience direction, they sort of went back and said, okay, so how are we going to scale this out? That's where the registry came in. It allowed different app teams that were all building their own agents to now contribute those skills into the registry, and then any other team can use them, right? So it's just more efficient. And there was a bunch of work that had to happen on the engineering side to support this. This is what's kind of happened in the last month or so. We had to build an integration service and an SDK to support skills. It includes evaluation tooling and the data sets to go ahead and assess skills for multiple teams to see if that skill is the right thing for their experience. We stood up a skills, like a UI or a playground where people can test them out. And then there's a lot of design guidance and patterns work that was going into publishing for teams. For example, you may have noticed we're using functional naming in the skills. That requires content design guidance for both the engineering teams and the designers to write those in the right way. So in summary, really what we're trying to do here is have the experience strategy, or what you want to do in the experience, influence the platform design. And then that platform should support the experiences. So this is sort of a flywheel. Obviously, you all have to work together. But I would say, at least in my experience, this has been relatively rare. I've mostly just built experiences on top of the infrastructure, the architecture that I was given, and tried to make the best of it, right? So I think thinking about a design sprint, I would just say, consider it. Maybe go home and talk one of your execs into it. The other big topics that we talked about was just like trust is driving adoption, but remember that expectation matching, that's super important. User research can help you there. You don't have to put a sparkle on everything. You don't have to call everything an AI. You don't have to call it all an agent. Asterisks on that is obviously compliance and stuff. There's times when people are using a high-risk AI feature or there's a higher chance of fabrication. In that case, call it AI because it's expectation management. Do your sprint. And then I think all of this stuff together will really help the teams work better to a shared vision. Atlassian, it's a huge company. We did this entire process in about a month, from design sprint to producing all of the pieces for the framework. That's like crazy fast for a large company like that. It's one of the reasons I joined, though, that we're being design-led from the ground up. And doing that is kind of like how we got there. So you're welcome to connect. I think we may have a minute for questions. And then I'll stay at the booth, the Atlassian booth, if you want to talk about it more. Or talk about Arrival and what a great movie it is. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Yeah.
We do have time this time for one question. So who has a burning question to Rachel? Anyone with a question?
No, none of my seated.
You all want to go for lunch.
Yeah.
Here's one. All the way in the front, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Pretty basic question, but since you say you're a design-driven company, do you still have to prove the methods like design sprint methodology and everything through revenue rising? And so what do you do then, and how is this backed up with such metrics?
Yeah. I mean, it's like any other investment. You do need to track it over time. For like that whiteboard agent and dissolving it, we're very closely tracking the usage and adoption to make sure that the thesis is true. But we also have another large body of research. In terms of, there's a like age-old design problem, and how do you connect the experience to like revenue? If you can solve that, let me know. Yeah, that one's a really hard one, and everyone always wants to show it. But I would say the shift to design-led strategy is more of a cultural change, right? You can think of like all of the platform wars. It's really like platform cold wars that are happening right now in AI. You've got all these companies that are doing really similar things. So and at some point, all that functionality, all the pricing, it's going to sort of homogenize. It's going to become relatively the same. And what's left is the experience. And like, who's going to nail the experience? So really, we're looking ahead, right, and investing now so that we can get those experience pieces so that in a year, 18 months, as stuff starts to resolve, we're ahead of the curve. Yeah.
Thank you. One more round of applause for Rachel Shepard.